The rock doesn't break men, it reveals them. They called it the rock, but the men who lived inside it knew a harder truth. Alcatraz wasn't built to rehabilitate, it was built to erase. Erase names, erase hope, erase the idea that a man could still be human once the world decided he was disposable. On a fog-heavy morning, when San Francisco looked like a rumor rather than a city, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson stepped off the boat in chains. He didn't flinch. Not when the iron doors slammed behind him. Not when the guards stripped him of his coat, his watch, his Harlem swagger. Not even when one of them leaned close and whispered something meant to shrink him. Because Bumpy had learned something long before Alcatraz. A man who survives Harlem doesn't fear silence, he studies it. The first rule of Alcatraz: no talking, no eye contact, no reactions. The guards believed control came from fear. Bumpy knew better. Control came from discipline. Inside his cell, cold stone, narrow cot, a slit of light, Bumpy didn't pace like the others. He didn't shout. He didn't beg. He sat, straight-backed, calm, breathing slow. Every man on that island was being tested, but not all tests looked like violence. Some looked like boredom, others looked like humiliation, and some looked like provocation. The guards who wanted a reaction. There were 3 guards who watched Bumpy more closely than the rest. They didn't like the way he walked, didn't like the way he didn't look down, didn't like that silence didn't scare him. To them, silence was defiance. They expected anger, they expected mistakes, they expected a man who would break. What they got instead was stillness, and stillness unsettles small minds. So they began testing him. Extra inspections, unnecessary delays, rules enforced only when it suited them. Nothing that could be written in a report, everything designed to provoke. Bumpy understood the game. If you lose your temper, you give them your power. So he didn't. 1 hour that changed everything. One afternoon, after a long work detail, Bumpy was ordered to remain behind. No explanation, no paperwork, just a quiet room and 3 men who thought authority meant dominance. They expected him to argue. He didn't. They expected to plead. He didn't. They expected fear. What they saw instead was a man who had already survived worse than this: hunger, betrayal, the streets, the constant weight of being targeted simply for existing. Bumpy didn't raise his voice. He raised his standards. He spoke once, calmly, clearly, without insult. That was enough to change the air in the room. Because courage doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just refuses to bend. Strength isn't what they think it is. People misunderstand strength. They think it's fists. They think it's volume. They think it's dominance. But real strength? It's knowing who you are when someone else is trying to decide that for you. Bumpy had already made peace with his past. He wasn't there to prove anything. He wasn't there to perform. He was there to endure. And endurance is terrifying to those who rely on intimidation. The island watches. Word spreads fast in a place with nothing but time. The other inmates noticed how Bumpy didn't rush, how he didn't react, how he didn't give the guards what they wanted. Respect in prison isn't given, it's observed. And slowly, quietly, Bumpy became something more dangerous than a troublemaker. He became unmovable. A quiet victory. That hour didn't end with shouting. It didn't end with chaos. It ended with something far more unsettling for the men who wanted control. It ended with Bumpy walking back to his cell, upright, silent, unchanged. No apology demanded, no submission offered. Just a man who refused to let cruelty redefine him. That night, as the fog swallowed the island and the lights dimmed, Bumpy lay on his cot and stared at the ceiling. He wasn't celebrating, he was preparing, because he knew something the guards didn't. Alcatraz breaks men who fight the wrong battles, and Bumpy Johnson had never wasted energy on battles that didn't matter.
The war you don't see is the one that decides everything. Time inside Alcatraz did not move forward the way it did in the outside world. It folded in on itself, days bleeding into each other until memory became the only calendar a man could trust. And for most prisoners, that was the most dangerous part of all. Men didn't lose their minds because of chains or walls alone. They lost them because nothing reflected back who they were anymore. But Bumpy Johnson refused to let the island become his mirror. Every morning he woke before the bell, not because he had to, but because routine was the last form of freedom left to him, and he guarded it with the same seriousness other men guarded their reputations. He stretched slowly, controlled his breathing, and rehearsed conversations in his mind, not with guards or inmates, but with the man he intended to be when the gates finally opened again, because survival without purpose was just another kind of death. The guards noticed the difference, even if they did not understand it. Bumpy did not shrink with time the way others did. Instead, he seemed to grow quieter and heavier, not in body, but in presence, as if the weight of the place pressed inward on everyone else, while he learned how to carry it without bending. Attempts to unsettle him became subtler, wrapped in procedure and delay, moments designed to remind him that his future was not his own. Yet every attempt failed, because Bumpy had already accepted the one truth that freed him from fear. Control over time was an illusion, but control over response was absolute. When a man stops reacting the way you expect, intimidation loses its language, and the silence that follows is often louder than threats. Other inmates began to seek him out, not openly because open association attracted attention, but quietly, through exchanged glances and cautious conversations during work details, where questions were asked indirectly and answers were given without instruction. Bumpy never preached, never positioned himself as a leader, never promised protection or advantage, but men listened because he spoke from a place deeper than bravado. He told them that rage was expensive and prison time was already overpriced, that dignity was not something guards could confiscate unless you handed it over willingly, and that surviving confinement was not about becoming harder, but about becoming clearer. In a place designed to reduce men to numbers, clarity became an act of rebellion. The psychological pressure intensified as weeks turned into months, not through open confrontation, but through repetition, the slow, grinding attempt to make a man feel insignificant by treating him as predictable. Meals arrived the same way, work details followed the same path, rules were enforced with selective precision, yet Bumpy turned predictability into armor rather than a cage. He memorized patterns, not to exploit them, but to remain grounded within them, understanding that awareness was a shield no baton could crack. The guards who once sought reactions now avoided his eyes, unsettled not because he challenged them, but because he reminded them that authority without respect was fragile, and fragility often masqueraded as cruelty. At night, when the island fell into that particular kind of silence that feels heavier than noise, Bumpy replayed his life, not with regret, but with analysis, tracing the choices that led him there without flinching from responsibility, because owning one's past stripped others of the power to weaponize it. He thought about Harlem, about loyalty and betrayal, about how strength on the streets had once meant speed and decisiveness, while strength on the rock meant patience and restraint. And in that contrast, he discovered growth he never expected. Alcatraz had not changed him into something weaker or smaller. It was refining him, burning away impulse and leaving behind intention, and that realization was more dangerous than any threat he could have made. By the time the guards understood that Bumpy Johnson was not being shaped by the prison, but was instead learning from it, it was already too late to reverse the damage to their assumptions.
He was no longer just an inmate passing time. He was a man who had learned how to stand still while pressure moved around him. And that kind of man is unsettling in any system built on dominance. Alcatraz had succeeded in isolating his body, but it had failed to isolate his will. And in doing so, it revealed its greatest weakness. Walls can contain flesh, but they cannot contain meaning. As the fog rolled in each evening and swallowed the island whole, Bumpy remained awake, not out of fear, but out of readiness, because he knew the true test was still ahead, and when it came, it would not be about fists or force, but about whether the lessons learned in silence could withstand the weight of the world beyond the rock.
What survives a prison leaves with you. As the months deepened into something that felt less like time and more like a permanent state of being, Bumpy Johnson came to understand that Alcatraz was not interested in punishment alone, but in erasure, and that the true danger was not what the prison could do to his body, but what it hoped to do to his memory of himself. Men around him slowly began to speak differently, move differently, and eventually think differently, adjusting their identities to fit the narrow expectations imposed on them. But Bumpy resisted that quiet surrender by anchoring himself to intention rather than circumstance. He treated each day not as something to endure blindly, but as material to be shaped, using repetition as discipline and isolation as an opportunity to sharpen awareness, knowing that a man who understands himself cannot be fully controlled by anyone else. The guards, no longer able to provoke him through intimidation, shifted toward indifference, a tactic often more corrosive than open hostility, because it aims to convince a man that he is invisible and therefore irrelevant. Bumpy recognized the danger immediately and countered it by maintaining presence in the only ways available to him, through posture, through tone, through the consistency of his actions, never allowing himself to fade into the background of his own life. Even when ignored, he remained deliberate, because being unseen by others did not require being unseen by oneself, and that distinction preserved a sense of agency that many around him quietly lost without realizing it. Within the inmate population, his influence grew not through control or command, but through example, as men observed how he navigated pressure without becoming bitter or reckless, how he absorbed disrespect without internalizing it, and how he refused to let confinement define the boundaries of his thinking. Conversations with him were rare and measured, but when they happened, they lingered in the minds of those who heard them, because Bumpy spoke less about survival and more about continuity, about ensuring that whatever version of yourself entered a place like Alcatraz was not the final version to leave it. He reminded men that prisons excel at interrupting lives, but only succeed at ending them when individuals stop believing in a future beyond the walls. What Bumpy learned during this period was not how to dominate others, but how to govern himself under pressure, and that education proved more valuable than any lesson learned on the streets. He understood now that unchecked force invites resistance, but controlled strength invites respect, and that the ability to choose restraint in an environment that rewards reaction is a form of power that few ever master. Alcatraz forced him to confront the difference between reputation and identity, teaching him that reputation depends on witnesses, while identity endures even in solitude. And it was this realization that allowed him to emerge mentally intact while others fractured under the same conditions. As whispers of eventual transfer and distant possibilities circulated, Bumpy did not cling to them for hope, because hope tied to timelines is fragile, and Alcatraz had taught him that fragile things break first. Instead, he focused on readiness, on ensuring that whenever the gates opened, whether sooner or later, he would walk out not as a man hardened by resentment, but as one tempered by understanding. He accepted that his past could not be rewritten, but he also recognized that meaning is not assigned by circumstance, but constructed through response. And in that understanding, he found a quiet confidence that no guard could strip away. By the end of this chapter of his confinement, Bumpy Johnson had become something the prison never intended to produce, a man who understood that freedom is not the absence of walls, but the presence of self-command, and that the most enduring victories are invisible to those who measure power only in immediate outcomes. Alcatraz had tested his limits, his patience, and his identity, but in doing so, it revealed the one truth that would follow him long after the island faded behind him, that a man who learns to survive without surrender does not leave prison empty-handed, because he carries forward a strength refined by pressure and a clarity earned through silence. And those are tools no system, no matter how absolute it appears, can ever fully take away.
What a man takes with him when the gates open. When the day finally came that Bumpy Johnson was told his time on the rock was ending, there was no ceremony, no acknowledgement of endurance, and no recognition of the transformation that had taken place within him, because systems built on control rarely admit when a man leaves stronger than he entered. He gathered his few possessions with the same calm precision he had practiced for years, understanding that departure was not a moment of triumph but of responsibility, because whatever he had learned in isolation would be tested immediately in a world that moved faster, spoke louder, and offered far more distractions than stone walls ever could. As he stepped away from Alcatraz and felt the movement of the boat beneath his feet, he did not romanticize survival or frame his endurance as heroism, but instead treated it as a lesson that demanded application, knowing that wisdom unused fades just as quickly as suffering forgotten. Returning to the world required a different kind of discipline than surviving confinement, because freedom does not come with instructions, and the habits built in silence can easily erode amid noise and temptation. Bumpy carried with him the understanding that power expressed without restraint invites chaos, while restraint exercised deliberately creates influence that lasts, and this insight reshaped how he approached every interaction thereafter. He no longer felt compelled to prove strength through confrontation or dominance, because Alcatraz had taught him that the most effective authority is quiet and consistent, grounded not in fear but in predictability and self-command. Where others rushed to reclaim lost time, he moved deliberately, aware that survival had already cost him enough years and that wasting the lessons learned would be the greatest loss of all. Those who encountered him after his release sensed the difference even if they could not name it, because Bumpy spoke less but listened more, reacted slower but decided faster, and carried himself with a steadiness that unsettled those accustomed to volatility. He understood now that reputation can be rebuilt, but character must be maintained daily, and that the real measure of growth is not whether a man changes under pressure, but whether he retains that change when the pressure is gone. Alcatraz had stripped away illusions, leaving behind a clarity that guided his choices, reminding him constantly that every decision either reinforced the man he had become or nudged him back toward the impulses that once ruled him. The legacy Bumpy carried forward was not one of violence or defiance, but of endurance shaped into awareness, and that legacy lived not in stories exaggerated over time, but in the way he navigated conflict, authority, and loyalty with a measured confidence born from having already faced erasure and refused it. He knew the world outside could be just as unforgiving as any prison, only less honest about its rules, and it was this awareness that allowed him to move through it without surrendering to bitterness or illusion. Alcatraz had taught him that dignity is not granted by circumstance, but claimed through conduct, and that lesson became the quiet foundation beneath every step he took afterward.
In the end, the true impact of Bumpy Johnson's time on the rock was not confined to what he survived there, but to what he refused to lose, because prisons can confine bodies, disrupt lives, and delay futures, but they cannot erase meaning from a man who chooses to guard it relentlessly. What Bumpy took with him when the gates closed behind him was not anger or vengeance, but a sharpened understanding of self, an awareness that freedom without discipline is fragile, and a conviction that resilience is not about how much pain a man can endure, but about how faithfully he can carry his principles through every environment he is forced to inhabit. And in that sense, long after Alcatraz faded into memory, its greatest failure was not that it failed to break him, but that it unknowingly prepared him to walk back into the world with a strength that no wall had ever been able to contain.